But this Lamar Sims had already expressed an opinion on the case before he'd been engaged, and they found that in a YouTube video online. That he had been a guest of Prosecutor Tim McGinty at a conference here in Cuyahoga County before he was engaged. We have confirmed from the prosecutor's office the video of that conference exists. We have repeatedly asked for copies of that conference, and they have refused to give it to us, even though it's a public record. That's probably yet another fight. Now, even more seriously, the other so-called expert, retired FBI agent, had her views rejected by the U.S. Department of Justice and the director of the FBI, Louis Freeh, in the Ruby Ridge civilian killings, where she had written an expert report that there are lots of civilians who died in Idaho. She was supposed to investigate, and she recommended that law enforcement be exonerated, as apparently is her habit. And the FBI director of the Department of Justice rejected her views as too extreme, as not applying the law correctly. So these are the people that our Cuyahoga County prosecutor engaged to be so-called experts. But let's look at their actual work. They assume facts and testimony that doesn't exist. Repeatedly in both reports, they say, the officers will say this, the officers say that, this is the officer's excuse, this is what they were thinking. How do we know that? They have not given sworn testimony. As is their right, by the way, under the Constitution. They are supposedly criminal investigation suspects. They have a right, under our Constitution, not to testify. But we have a right not to have our prosecutor and his so-called bogus experts assume what they will say.
That's right. That's right.
You read these reports and you will see that that's exactly what they did. They assume testimony that is non-existent. They then go on to ignore certain critical facts in this matter, which I've just talked to you about, that the officers rush upon the boy and fire immediately, apparently totally irrelevant. That they leave a 12-year-old boy bleeding and dying on the ground, totally irrelevant to them, not discussed at all in either report, including the third report that was just released by the prosecutor. A third report, I might add, that was released that very evening that clergy throughout this community in a multiracial, multi-faith coalition had called for him to step aside from this case. He stepped on the story and the highly political act released that report, just as local media were about to focus on that story. So, those are among the critical facts that are ignored. Those are among the critical facts that are made up and manufactured in these so-called expert reports. And there's one other really key, there's several problems, but I'll summarize with this. There's one other really key thing that you need to know about these so-called expert reports. They ignore the law in the Sixth Circuit, which governs our community, that says whether the officers themselves create a danger, then they can't use that as an excuse to engage in the deadly force. That is the law. So, on October 16th, we sent a detailed letter to the prosecutor laying out these concerns with the reports and asking him not to rely on them and asking him to respond to us. It is now November 21st. We have no response from the prosecutor. He's happy to go out and make public statements that double down on these so-called experts, that publicly praise them, that vouch for them personally, talk about how, quote, highly touted they are. Which is, by the way, improper for a lawyer to do.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
We are not allowed to personally vouch for our witnesses. We're not allowed to do that. We can talk about their background and their credentials, but we aren't supposed to personally vouch for them like they're our personal buddies. Okay? So, we don't get a substantive response on October 16th. Then, after that, as many of you have probably seen the video clip, the prosecutor then attacks Tamir Rice. Here's the context in which he did it. He's asked the question by a reporter at this public forum in Fairview Park. This is November 5th. He's asked the question, will Tamir Rice and her counsel have asked that you step aside from the case to assure the appearance of propriety in the matter. What's your reaction? His first instinct is not to respond to the substance of our criticism. His first instinct is to attack. And so he says, well, they have economic motives and they're interesting people, let me leave it at that. Words to that effect. Now, where is the economic motive in losing a child? Where is the economic motive in asking for justice through the criminal justice process? The prosecutor's PR flap, who used to be a deputy editorial page editor and a plain dealer, put out a statement that evening recognizing the damage and trying to dial it back, said, oh, no. He wasn't trying to attack Tamir Rice. It's just the lawyer. That's what it is, right? Tamir is here. She can tell you. We are simply summarizing her views. So an attack on her lawyers is an attack on her for all that. You can't dial it back. You can't walk that back. In that unscripted, unguarded moment, he's really said what he's really
He's showing his hand.
But not responding to the substance. November 9th, we sent a letter objecting to his outrageous treatment of the family and those statements. We then sent a follow-up letter again after he then issues yet a third report laying out all the issues with that report. And I want to mention one thing about this third so-called expert. He was the prosecutor's hired gun in the Brillo matter. And let me tell you what some of the things that he testified in the Brillo matter tell me if they sound familiar like they ought to apply in this matter. He said an officer should assess the situation, should rush in, and shouldn't start firing. That's what he testified under oath in that case. Doesn't that sound like that's what he should be saying in this case? Prosecutor who's looking at the report would immediately spot the contradiction and say, what's wrong with you? Why are you flipping over with a completely different point of view now? Unless the reports are ordered for a particular purpose. Now, I want to note one other interesting thing that the prosecutor said on November 5th at that forum. He was asked a question by an activist, I don't think he's here, Rick Nagin, who was a member of the Justice for Tamir. And Rick walked up to the prosecutor afterward. He signed a sworn affidavit to this effect. He said to the prosecutor, are you also going to present Judge Ron Adrian's opinion that there is probable cause to charge these officers? Are you going to present that to the grand jury? The prosecutor's response was, Judge Adrian hasn't sent me anything. As if we don't know it exists, as if he doesn't know where to get it, as if he doesn't have a copy of it. His next response was, they read the papers, as if it's proper for a prosecutor to invite the grand jurors to just read whatever they want to in the newspapers and don't worry about the evidence that's being presented to them or not. And then he said, well, you're trying to accuse me of hiding evidence, which of course Mr. Nagin was not trying to do. At that point, according to Mr. Nagin, the prosecutor became so agitated that Mr. Nagin just walked away, even though he also wanted to ask, and are you also going to present Professor Jonathan Rich's opinions about the op-ed and the plain dealer? He's a professor at the Cleveland Marshall College of Law. He said there's no role for so-called expert reports here, telling the grand jury what to think, because all the grand jurors are supposed to do is apply law to the facts. They're basically, these so-called experts are substituting themselves for the jurors' own job. Yeah. And what Professor Whitner-Rich said is this is an issue that ultimately needs to be decided by a criminal jury, a jury in a criminal case. But unfortunately, the prosecutor is not answering that question. I wanted to share these things with you so that you understand that the letter of October 16th, the letter of November 9th, the letter from earlier this week objecting to the other third so-called expert, that those letters go unanswered. While the prosecutor goes on Fox 8 and talks about how he's being transparent and being fair and has a great relationship with Tamir Rice, it's nonsense. This This to the family is perceived as an effort to sabotage the potential for prosecution. It is perceived as a charade and a shame. So will there be justice for Tamir through the criminal justice process? Tamir Rice holds on to that hope, holding on to the thought that perhaps the grand jurors themselves will take control of the process. Perhaps they will be able to realize that the prosecutor is flim-flamming them and stacking the deck, if you will, against a charge. But that's hard for grand jurors to do. You've all heard the adage that a prosecutor could get a grand jury to indict a ham sandwich.
That's right.
The reason behind that old expression is that it is a one-sided presentation. And the grand jurors become familiar with the friendly prosecutor, and their ability, their judgment sometimes, to be able to look beyond what the prosecutor is willing to share with them gets clouded. Because one thing we can count on, now that the prosecutor has publicly praised how wonderful these so-called experts are, we can count on the fact that he will not vigorously cross-examine them in front of the grand jury, point out their biases, point out the facts they ignored, point out the facts that they simply made up. We know that because he's all but promised us that by telling us how wonderful they are.
Yes.
So, ladies and gentlemen, I know that the message I'm bringing to you today on behalf of the Rice family is sobering. It is not a pleasant thing to hear. It is not a pleasant thing to say and to have to report to you. But it's something we need to know. And that is that it appears to the Rice family that what the prosecutor is doing is steering this process toward a no bill, thus denying the prospect of justice to the family when we all saw what we saw in that video. It is akin to that scene in The Wizard of Oz when Toto has exposed what's behind the curtains, and the prosecutor, the wizard, says, "Pay no attention." Video tells us what we need to know. The prosecutor, the Rice family believes, is trying to divert attention from the core important facts and distract attention with these so-called expert reports. So while the prospect for justice for Tamir in the criminal process may appear bleak, there's still that strand of hope, but it may appear bleak. The role for all of you remains. We want to have a community in which we all feel safe and respected and treated with dignity, that we all have a lot of work to do. And for that, the Rice family